Remember, you can continue to support this ministry, this move, this church, via your tithes, offerings, and your love gifts, which can be done digitally. You can do on the Easy Tithe app that you can find in Google Play or the iStore, or you can go to easytithe.com, download the app there, and you can connect with Praise Chapel Fresno that way. You can also go to praisechapelfresno.com, click Give in the upper menu. It's going to take you to a third-party website that we're contracted with that you can continue to give on there. Or if you're joining us at our in-person services, we have envelopes behind each and every one of our chairs. You can fill it out and drop it off in the tithes and offerings box located just outside the sanctuary, and we'll get a deposit in a timely manner. If you're joining us on our online campus only, you don't want to do the digital thing, you can go ahead and mail it in. We'll get a deposit in a timely manner. And if you need our address, just Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California. You'll see our address. Mail it in that way. We'll get it deposited. But it seems like everybody's pretty much either in person or using a digital method. I haven't had to deposit from mail for a while. I kind of got freaked out when I saw a letter. I'm like, we do everything digital, like everything's paperless. But remember, we are in the third day of our corporate fast. I don't know about you, but I have never felt more weak today than I've felt like all in my entire life. Me and my wife have chosen and elected at this point to do a strict Daniel fast. If you don't know what that is basically vegan, I'd say, vegetarian, no meats, no nothing like that. And Pastor Will likes a steak, and I don't get any of that. My wife was cooking tofu and mushrooms. So Pastor Will's been eating a lot of salads. But remember to keep strong in that. If there are some people that may complain and say like doing this fast is taking this, well, find another fast to do. Don't just give up on the whole thing. Find another fast to do that will allow you, we want it to be about a sacrifice, but I also want to make sure that people stay consistent. And I'm going to be talking about the commitments that some people make and sticking to them. So just remember that we do have the flyers that we kind of have up at the front. For if you want to keep track of it, we do have it online. But it's just to make sure, that a corporate fast is done because we as a body are choosing to unite and focus on specific areas. And so we've kind of done that through this kind of checkoff list that keeps us all on track for where we're at in the fast, what we can pray for. And then again, there's some examples of how to use the Word of God in your prayer time, how to use that are attached to it as well. But again, only day 3, and I'm getting lightheaded from time to time. I got winded going from my room to my office, which is basically about 25 feet. And I'm not drinking any coffee or anything like that. Like strict Daniel fast was water and fruits and vegetables. That's it. So it's not a good time at my house right now. But we are praying like crazy, and I hope you guys are praying as well too, because fasting without praying is just dieting. So we're still doing our biblical bios, and the next one that I came up with was, as you kind of get out of the book of Judges, the book of Ruth just kind of punches you in the face. It's right there. And I'm going to be honest, I've never really delved into the book of Ruth, only because every time there was I've been going to church all my life, and every time there was a women's conference or women's discipleship, they always spoke about Ruth. So I felt like I knew Ruth pretty well. I didn't feel like I needed to dive into it, but her biblical reference, the book doesn't even start with her. It starts with something else going on, and then she's mentioned after that. But the story of Ruth really isn't just focused on Ruth. It's more focused on her mother-in-law, Naomi, because Ruth says very little in this book. She does a lot of things, but she speaks minimally. She's got 3 or 4 times where it actually writes down what she says. She's one of the most notable women in the Bible, and she's not even an Israelite. She comes from a tribe that are consistent and perpetual enemies of Israel. She's basically the epitome of loyalty. Whenever someone wants a biblical reference of loyalty, I would always tell someone just go read the book of Ruth now, because of her loyalty to her mother-in-law. She's also a demonstration of God's concern was not just for Israel. It was not based on a person's nationality. It was based on a person's heart. So even at this point, when God had chosen the people of Israel and they have their laws that they have to live by, she was an enemy. Now, she was married to an Israelite, and she basically converted to Judaism through this marriage, but she was still from a country that God had actually already prophesied to destroy. So because of their attacks against Israel. So here she's coming into this and she's an enemy, but yet God still uses her and God still blesses her. So she's kind of one of the first examples that this really isn't about where you're born from, it's about where your heart is. But Ruth's heart was committed to God, and she becomes the great-grandmother of David, and she remains in the bloodline of Jesus Christ because of what she's done. So the first mention of her comes in Ruth. It's verse 1, 3 through 5. And it says, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died. That has nothing to do with Ruth at this point. And she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. One of them was named Orpah, and the second one was named Ruth. And after they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahalan and Chilion also died, and the woman was left without her 2 children and without her husband. Whenever I read the name Orpah, I kind of chuckle inside just because it sounds like a ridiculous name, but they had some really ridiculous names back there. But I could just see a dad, mom's like, oh, her name will be Orpah. And the dad's like, seriously? But all 3 are widowed. So Naomi and Orpah, they find out that God has been providing for the people of Israel. Now, this is during the famine that we can see from previous ones, that God calls a famine on it. This is where they wanted to go to Egypt, and God tells them, no, stay where you're at because I'm going to bless you here. This is that famine that's going on. And so they realize that God is providing for their people, and they're basically in Moab, and they have nothing. Women couldn't technically own property at this time, so when the husband died, it would usually go to the sons, but now the sons are dead, so she has no legal right to that land at this point. So they decide to go back to Israel, but Naomi knows that her daughter-in-laws are facing not only the struggle of being widows without any support, but that they're also enemies of Israel. And she knows that they're going to have to face this. And I'll get to that in a second, I'm sorry. Naomi also knows that they have relatives that live in Moab. So she's telling them, if you guys stay in Moab, you guys will potentially have what's called a family redeemer. So in those days, if you were widowed, what would happen is your husband's brother would be the next person in line that would have to provide for you. But he wouldn't provide for you in a financial status or anything like that. He would provide for you in a son. And that was his duty. Well, Naomi has no prospects. The 2 girls, she's telling them, if you stay here, you guys can potentially be rescued. And this is how they respond. Ruth 1:10, they said to her, we are insisting on returning with you to your people. This starts to establish Ruth's character and her loyalty in Naomi. But they love their mother-in-law so much they can't bear the thought of leaving her, not only to make this journey alone, but then leaving her and her going back into Israel and still not having anyone to redeem her. She's too old to remarry. There aren't any close relatives to care for her, so they're concerned. They know that not only is life going to be much more difficult in Israel, but they still choose to stay with Naomi. We're having some technical difficulties right now. She begins to tell them how bitter God has made her. And I think that is so hilarious because she mentions, and she's like, you guys need to go back, you need to stay there. But when they decide to stay with her, she starts telling them how bitter she is towards God. So she's not only telling them, look, stay here, you'll have an easier life. She's saying, if you stay with me, not only are you going to become bitter, but I'm pretty sure God has cursed my life, so you're taking that on with you. But this is how Ruth replies. It's in 1:16. But Ruth replied, let me deal with Orpah real quick. Take that off. Orpah decides that she's kind of convinced, they're about halfway over, so she's kind of convinced that life's going to be a little bit easier in Moab, so she decides to leave, but this is what Ruth says. Ruth replies, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, your God will be my God. Pretty bold statement because she's telling her, you may die, but if you die, so am I. Naomi and Ruth enter Bethlehem, and everybody is basically excited to see them. They start mentioning, oh my gosh, Naomi's here. And she basically drops whatever she has in her hand. She says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because God has made me bitter. She's still on this binge. It took them a while to get back into Bethlehem, and she's still on that. And the Bible says she stopped speaking to Ruth during this travel. It says she stopped speaking, and then this is the first time that it's recorded that she opens her mouth. So Ruth is following a bitter mother-in-law, a bitter Jewish mother-in-law who hasn't spoken to her. She even tells them that she's being treated as an enemy of God because of all this. They live close to a land of a relative, kind of a distant relative, and it's it's interesting. Like, Israel kind of sets up the first social support system in a really unique way. So farmers in these days, they were encouraged to basically not farm all of their land. They're kind of told that they should kind of like not do the corners, and that even if a bundle falls on the ground, they can't pick it up. And the way that works is it's a social assistance program that is developed to get those that are less fortunate, the poor, that don't have anything to eat. It would get them to work for their food. So they would follow during the harvest, and whatever fell off or whatever wasn't harvested, they themselves could collect. So Ruth goes to collect, and Boaz sees her, and she's basically, it's called gleaning. They go and they just take whatever they can. And then Ruth 2:8 says, Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and do not leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants." There's an obvious reason for that. These dudes in Israel were crazy, and most of the times if they found a woman on their own, nothing good happened of it. So he's telling her, like, look, just stay in my field and stay with my female servants. She's grateful, but then she tells him, I'm not due this honor. I'm a foreigner in your land. Now, he goes a little bit further into telling her that he knows everything about her and is giving her this honor because she's taking care of her mother-in-law. So she tells him, like, I'm a foreigner, and he, like, goes into great details. Not only are you a foreigner, but your mother-in-law's husband died, then your husband died, and you decided to come here, and she didn't want you to come, and you stayed with her. And then he tells her, he prays that she receives a full reward from God for her loyalty to Naomi. Now, that's a little interesting because of the fact that she's a foreigner. So even at this point, Jewish law really wasn't taught into the other countries. God discouraged them from intermarrying. God discouraged them from this because he was concerned about pagan gods being brought over into Israel, which it like happened all the time for some reason. So he knows that she's from this land, but he's praying that God rewards her for what she's done for Naomi, because he knows that her heart is in the right place. He knows that she's doing this for the right reason, so he wants God to bless her. Then he allows her to take some of the grain that had already been harvested, not just the scraps that she could find on the floor, and then she takes it back to Naomi. Then Naomi tells Ruth, go back to Boaz. She gives her some very questionable tips about dating. And then, but Ruth follows everything that she tells her, and it works. And Boaz says this is in Ruth 3:11. He says, now don't be afraid, my daughter. I will do for you whatever you say, since all the people in my town know that you are a woman of a notable character. So Ruth tells her, like, oh yeah, go when he's asleep, after he has drunken himself into like a slumber, and then lay at his feet. And I guess that is like a hot dating tip at that time, because when she does it, he comes up, and what Boaz begins to do is he begins to tell her that he's not the next in line to redeem her. He tells her there's someone else, and that person has to redeem you. But Moabite women in this time, they were weaponized in a very unique way. When the king of Moab was trying to destroy Israel, this guy comes up and he's like, hey, let's just send our women in. And they can start kind of flirting around. They can get with some of these Jewish guys, and we can kind of take them over that way. And so they were weaponized by sending into Israelite camps to seduce them and get them into pagan worship. And it worked so well that God even sends a plague of death when this happened. Here Boaz is telling her that she shares none of the characteristics of the women from her country, because all Moabite women would have been kind of viewed in that light. The issue here is that there's a younger relative that should step in and take care of them, and Boaz says, I can't overrule that. He has to decide not to redeem you. He's going to honor that lineage, and the family redeemer tells Boaz he's going to speak with them. He wants to redeem Naomi and Ruth. He gives her more food. He takes her back to Naomi, and she reports what happened. And then, Naomi tells her, like, okay, get back out there and figure this out, because he's going to go talk to this guy today. And then after a very simple negotiation, he talks with this man. He's like, hey, you want to redeem her? No, Naomi? And he's like, yeah, she has a lot of land. And he's like, okay, if you redeem Naomi, you also get Ruth. And he's like, I don't want to redeem her. And so he gives up his right, and Boaz comes in, and he redeems her in the sight of towns and witnesses. He declares that he will redeem Naomi, but he will take Ruth as a wife. So this is interesting because I looked this up. It's actually in Jewish law that if the woman was too old to have an heir, he could take a servant of hers. And he could provide an heir for her, because as soon as the baby's born, like, Ruth isn't mentioned again. And everyone's like, oh my gosh, Naomi had a kid. And I'm like, no, she didn't. Like, Ruth had the kid. But that's part of Jewish law. So he takes her, they have a son, they name him Obed, who will eventually have a son named Jesse, which fathers David, who becomes king of Israel. So here's 4 things that we can learn from Ruth. Number 1, doing the right thing isn't always easy. Ruth had a pretty hard life, and it only got worse as she continued to follow her mother-in-law. First, her husband dies, then all the men in the family die. She leaves her homeland to live in enemy territory. Every day from sunup to sundown, from Boaz's description of her, she's working harder than some of the men he's employed. But she did what she knew to be right. Her life didn't immediately turn around, but it would eventually fall into place. But she had to keep doing what she knew was right, and things began to change. Now, keeping our faith is not always the easiest thing. With each trial that we face, our faith begins, and God begins to take these plans and set them in motion. But what we have to understand is it's not always easy to keep our faith. And a lot of times when we're going through these things, it does help strengthen our faith, but we have to keep with it. Because God says, I can put plans in place to prosper you, but you have to keep working. Every day. Now, think of this. Boaz is giving her food. Boaz is giving her exactly what she's going out there to work for. And she keeps working every single day, even knowing that Boaz may supply her with it. But she says, but I have to keep working. She has to keep going towards it. Don't give up just because things get harder. Salvation isn't a quick fix to all of life's problems, but it puts you in direct contact with the one that can take the plans, turn them to prosper you. Number 2, keep your commitments. One of the hardest things for people to believe in about faith is to believe in other Christians. Because we make commitments and we just don't follow through with it. We decide, oh yeah, I'll do this, or I'll be there for you, and then when someone reaches out, it's like, oh, I can't today. And so we start losing faith in one another. Here, God honored Ruth because of the commitment she made, not because of everything else. She made a commitment, decided to stick with it, stuck with her choice, and God honored that. She could have had a much easier life had she just returned to Moab, but she stuck with her decision, and God honored her for it. Number 3, don't return to the old life. If Ruth had returned to Moab, she might have had an easier life. She had family redeemers over there. She could go in. She could be taken care of by her family. But she had prospects for remarrying and would have been higher. Her life would have been easier, but that's not where God was going to use her. It always feels like life is always easier in the old ways. It always feels that way. Anytime that I've gone through things, I always think of, when I didn't have to, when I wasn't going to church, when I wasn't doing it, things just seemed so much easier. Well, guess what happens in Moab? They're going to get conquered by 2 different other countries, the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and they're going to get wiped off the face of the earth. Now, God had already prophesied that Moab would be destroyed, but it happens and they're no longer around, or that countryside was no longer around. The only thing waiting in the world is death and destruction. The only thing waiting in faith is life and restoration. Number 4, your character speaks louder than your words. For being such an influential figure in the Bible, only one of 2 books of the Bible that are named after women, one that is usually the center of every Christian woman's gathering, she speaks very little in this book. So it's not so much about what she says that people see, it's what they see her doing. Boaz didn't need to be convinced of who she was. He saw her working hard every single day. He heard the people, he saw her courage, he saw her loyalty to her mother-in-law, he heard what the townspeople were saying about him. And he speaks very highly of her when he uses noble, meaning she carries characteristics of nobility. She has no home, she has no prospects, but he calls her noble just because of her character. Do we live by the same words that we speak? If someone was attempting to describe you to someone else, would they be able to describe the character of Jesus Christ? Every day is another opportunity we have to show the world that Jesus Christ is alive and still changing this world. That's the book of Ruth. Now, Ruth, it's very short, very easy to kind of go through. I'm just shocked that it's a book named Ruth, and when you read it, there is more about Naomi than there is about Ruth. But the book is focused on a woman who decided to keep her commitments, who decided to follow through with everything that she said she was doing, and even when it was hard, still kept her commitment, didn't even have to speak to change lives. Because I've heard so many women, even from our own church, from our fellowship, going to conferences where it was focused on Ruth, and they're saying, my life was changed. She's changing, and she didn't even have to talk. She didn't have to say that much to change people's lives. But that's the book of Ruth. Remember, we're still in our 21-day fast. Stick with it. If you're having problems with one that you're on, find another fast. I know it's about sacrifice, but consistency. Keep with it. Follow through with it. If it's a commitment you made, stick with it. But we love you guys. Thank you for all the words of encouragement that have been coming through, even from afar. Those that have just been texting and thanking for what we're doing. We appreciate that you guys are taking part in this. But we would love for you guys to join us. But remember, if you're in person, grab one of these checkoffs so you can keep in tune with what we're doing as a corporate body through this fast. But stick with it. God's going to do something amazing, and just stick with it. But don't forget, you can continue to support this church, this ministry, this move of God. You can do that with tithes and offerings via EasyTithe. It's a smartphone app that you can find in Google Play or the iStore. You can also go to easytithe.com, download the app, and you can connect with us that way. Or you can go to www.praisechapelfresno.com, click give in the menu bar. It's going to take you to a third-party website we're contracted with. Or if you're joining us in our in-person services, we have tithes and offerings envelopes behind each and every one of our chairs, and our tithes and offerings box is located just outside the sanctuary. You can drop it off there. We'll get it deposited. If you're joining us on the online campus only and you don't feel like you want to do the digital method, you can still mail in or drop off your tithes, offerings, and love gifts via our campus address. If you don't know what that is, just Google Praise Chapel Fresno, California. You'll see our address. Mail it in there. We'll get it deposited in a timely manner. We love you guys. Stick with the fast. We're on day 3, but God's going to do something amazing, because I have never felt this week and have not seen God do miracles and wonders. So just stick with it. We're day 3, but we're going to keep pushing forward. We love you. We'll see you guys Sunday, 10 a.m., either live casted or in person here at the church. We love you. We'll see you then.